Home Alone opened in November 1990 and became the highest-grossing comedy film ever made at that point in history. $600 million worldwide on an $18 million budget. It turned an 8-year-old boy into one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, gave the world a villain duo that became the template for every slapstick antagonist that followed, and delivered a Christmas movie so completely embedded in the holiday's identity that it is still airing on television every December, still watched by children who were born long after it was made, and still producing the same involuntary winces when paint cans connect with faces on staircases. None of it was supposed to happen. Home Alone wasn't a prestige production or a franchise launcher. It was the product of one writer's specific parental anxiety, John Hughes asking himself what would actually happen if you forgot one of your kids, combined with a director's instinct for physical comedy and a child actor who happened to be exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Hughes wrote the script in 9 days, the studio that first had it passed on the budget, and the boy who eventually played Kevin McCallister very nearly didn't get the role at all. These are 15 facts about Home Alone, how it was nearly killed in development, how Joe Pesci prepared for a family comedy the way he prepared for Goodfellas, and why the emotional ending almost got cut from a film that turned out to need it more than anything else. Stick around for number 15 to find out how one film permanently changed what Hollywood believed a family comedy could earn. Before we set the traps, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the classic films that defined a generation. Number 1, the studio that almost killed the film before it started. Home Alone was originally set up at Warner Brothers, where John Hughes had a productive relationship following the success of his earlier films. The script was written, the budget was discussed, and the project was moving toward production when the studio made a calculation that has since become one of the most cited examples of institutional second-guessing in Hollywood history. They decided the budget, approximately $15 million at that stage, was too high for the material, and they passed. Hughes took the project to Fox, where it was greenlit with a budget that ended up being slightly higher than the number Warner Brothers had rejected. The decision to pass cost Warner Brothers a film that would eventually earn over $600 million worldwide. It has been referenced in industry conversations about development risk ever since, as an illustration of the gap between what studio executives can predict about a film's potential and what audiences actually decide. The gap between the production budget and the eventual gross, a return of roughly $33 for every dollar spent, remains one of the most dramatic ratios in the history of studio filmmaking. Warner Brothers' decision to pass is now institutional legend, the kind of story that gets told in development meetings as a cautionary example of what happens when the numbers on a page don't capture what a story can become. Number 2, John Hughes wrote the script in 9 days. The speed at which John Hughes wrote screenplays was a defining characteristic of his creative method, and Home Alone represented that method operating at its most compressed. The script was completed in approximately 9 days, from the initial idea to a draft ready for development. Hughes had trained himself to write quickly because he believed that revision, after a certain point, removed the aliveness that the first version contained. The specific texture of feeling that came from writing before the analytical mind had fully engaged and begun making corrections. The premise arrived as a genuine anxiety rather than a calculated pitch. Hughes had children and had experienced the specific parental terror of the mental inventory, the moment of checking whether everyone is accounted for, and the cold pause when the count doesn't immediately come out right. He extended that moment into a scenario and followed the logic of it. If you actually left a child behind and the child was actually on his own for several days, what would happen? Not the disaster version of that question, but the version in which the child was fundamentally competent and the situation produced discovery rather than catastrophe. The 9-day timeline is significant not because it suggests the script required no skill, but because it demonstrates that some projects arrive in a form closer to their final shape than the development process usually allows. Home Alone went through further revisions, but the fundamental architecture of what the film became was present in those first 9 days. Number 3. Macaulay Culkin almost didn't get the role. The casting process for Kevin McCallister was longer and more genuinely uncertain than the film's eventual success might suggest. John Hughes had worked with Macaulay Culkin on Uncle Buck and had a strong sense of what the boy could do, but the studio and the director needed to be convinced that Culkin could carry a film, not appear in scenes or provide supporting moments, but carry an entire movie on his shoulders for close to 2 hours. Several other young actors were read for the role before the decision was made. The concern wasn't Culkin's talent, which was apparent from the early auditions, but his ability to sustain the specific quality the film required across a full production schedule. Kevin McCallister is in virtually every scene of Home Alone, and the film only works if the audience's investment in Kevin is genuine and continuous. A single extended sequence where the lead performance doesn't convince would have undermined the entire construction. What settled the question was a specific moment in Culkin's audition in which he was asked to perform Kevin's panic, the realization that his family was gone. The quality he found in that moment, which combined genuine feeling with the self-aware intelligence that defined the character, demonstrated that he understood Kevin not as a collection of comic reactions, but as a person with a specific interior life. That understanding was what the film needed, and it was not something that could have been coached into a performance that didn't already contain it. Number 4. Joe Pesci deliberately avoided Macaulay Culkin between takes. Joe Pesci's preparation for Harry Lime involved a decision that was unusual enough in the context of a family comedy that it became one of the most discussed aspects of the film's production. He chose to stay largely in character between takes and specifically avoided forming a friendly relationship with Macaulay Culkin off camera. The reasoning was practical rather than abstract. Pesci wanted Kevin McCallister's wariness of Harry to be genuine rather than performed, and he understood that a child actor's relationship to an adult performer on set would inevitably influence the emotional quality of their scenes together. If Culkin spent time with Pesci between takes and found him warm and approachable, the natural result would be a relaxation in their scenes together that would soften the edge the character required. By maintaining distance, Pesci ensured that Culkin's reactions to Harry carried a residue of actual uncertainty. Not fear, exactly, but the specific alertness of a child who isn't quite sure what an adult is capable of. This was a more sophisticated piece of craft than the film's premise required, and it reflects the seriousness with which Pesci approached material that was, on its surface, broad physical comedy. The approach occasionally required management from Columbus, who needed both performers to be accessible and functional within a production schedule that couldn't accommodate extended character work between every setup. The balance between Pesci's method instincts and the practical demands of the shoot became one of the recurring negotiations of the production. Number 5. The house became a permanent tourist destination. The McCallister family home, located at 671 Lincoln Avenue in Winnetka, Illinois, was a private residence before Home Alone was filmed there and remained one after production wrapped. This fact has not prevented it from becoming one of the most visited film locations in the United States every December, drawing visitors from around the world who make the trip to Winnetka specifically to stand in front of the house, take photographs, and experience whatever specific form of cultural pilgrimage the location represents for them. The owners of the house have handled the attention with varying degrees of accommodation over the decades. During peak holiday season, the foot traffic around the property can be significant enough to create logistical challenges for the surrounding neighborhood. The house itself has changed somewhat since 1990. Renovations, exterior modifications, the natural evolution of a lived-in property across 30 years. But it remains recognizable enough that visitors arrive with confidence. In 2021, the house was listed on Airbnb for a special holiday period booking, allowing a small number of guests to actually stay in the property. The listing was processed through the platform's standard mechanism despite the obvious demand asymmetry, and the response was immediate enough to crash the booking system temporarily. The event demonstrated that the cultural investment in the physical location had not diminished across 3 decades. If anything, it had intensified.
Number 6. John Williams treated it like a serious film. When John Williams agreed to score Home Alone, he made a decision that the film's producers were cautious about, and that turned out to be one of the most important creative choices in the film's history. He scored it as if it were a serious family drama with comic elements rather than a broad comedy with sentimental moments. The distinction matters because music tells an audience how to feel, and a score that signals "this is silly" produces a different emotional engagement than one that signals "this matters." Williams composed thematic material of genuine sophistication, particularly Somewhere in My Memory, which was written for full orchestra and choir and treated Kevin's emotional reality with the kind of compositional attention that Williams normally reserved for Spielberg productions, and in doing so he elevated the film's emotional register above what the script alone could have achieved. The result was that audiences felt more during the film than they expected to. The reunion between Kevin and his mother at the end was not, in script terms, a particularly complex scene. A child and a parent who has been away come back together. Williams's score transformed it into something that genuinely moved people, and that emotional completion was part of why the film's word of mouth was so strong in its opening weeks. Williams received an Academy Award nomination for the score, which was unusual for a family comedy, and reflected the critical recognition that his contribution had done something distinctive with the material. Number 7. The tarantula was real, and Joe Pesci was genuinely terrified. The scene in which Marv discovers a tarantula on his face during the break-in sequence is one of the film's most viscerally effective comic moments, and it achieved its quality in part because Daniel Stern's reaction was built around genuine physical discomfort rather than performed fear. The tarantula used in the scene was a real animal, handled by a professional on set, and introduced to Stern's face under controlled conditions. Stern had agreed to the scene but discovered during preparation that his tolerance for the experience was somewhat lower than he had estimated. The performance captures something that is not quite acting, the specific physical quality of a person managing an involuntary response while maintaining enough control to stay in the scene. The more significant animal story from the production involved Joe Pesci, who was required to interact with the tarantula in a different setup and whose reaction was described by crew members as less composedly professional than Stern's. Pesci's discomfort with the animal was genuine and extended, and the management of that discomfort, keeping the production moving while accommodating a lead performer's real physical aversion, required a level of on-set diplomacy that was not reflected in the finished scene. The tarantula itself became one of the more celebrated animal performances in family cinema of the era, largely because the specificity of its placement on Stern's face was so precise that it suggested either exceptional animal training or exceptional production coordination. It was, in fact, both. Number 8. The aftershave scene was almost cut. The moment in which Kevin, alone in the house and exploring his new freedom, applies aftershave to his face for the first time and screams in pain has become one of the film's most reproduced images. The hands on the cheeks, the open mouth, the expression of comic suffering that directly echoes Edvard Munch's, the scream in a composition so precise that it is clearly intentional. What is less well known is that the scene was nearly removed during editing. The question in the cutting room was whether the sequence slowed the film's pace at a point where the story needed to be establishing Kevin's situation rather than generating individual comic moments. The argument for cutting it was structural. The scene contributed nothing to the plot and could be removed without creating any continuity problems. The argument for keeping it was tonal. The scene was one of the clearest expressions of what made Kevin distinct as a character, his combination of independence and inexperience, the way his competence in some areas coexisted with genuine naivety in others. Aftershave was adult territory that Kevin was exploring because adulthood was suddenly available to him, and his reaction to it was funny precisely because it was honest. Columbus kept the scene, and the image it produced became the film's most reproduced promotional still. The decision to retain a scene that didn't advance the plot in favor of one that illuminated the character was one of the editing choices that contributed most to the film's emotional coherence. Quick pause while Kevin sets his traps. If these facts are bringing back memories of watching Home Alone every Christmas, take a second to like and subscribe before the wet bandits figure out what's waiting for them. It helps Back Before TV and cinema keep exploring the classic films that shaped how entire generations experience the holidays. Tell us in the comments, where were you the first time you saw Home Alone, and do you still watch it every December? Back to the facts. Number 9. Daniel Stern had to mime the scream in the tarantula scene. When Daniel Stern performed the scene in which Marv discovers the tarantula on his face and opens his mouth in a scream, he was required to do it silently. The tarantula, like all animals used in film production, was subject to welfare protocols that limited the duration and conditions of its time on set. Introducing the sound of a genuine scream in the immediate vicinity of the animal, at a volume consistent with what the scene required, was assessed as a potential stressor that could provoke an unpredictable response. Stern mimed the scream during filming. The sound was added in post-production, recorded separately in conditions that didn't involve the animal. The disconnect between the visual and audio elements of the moment is invisible in the finished film. The post-production team matched them precisely, but the production process that produced it was considerably more complicated than the seamless result suggests. This was not unusual for animal work in film production. but it is a useful illustration of the gap between what audiences see and what the process of producing it actually involved. The scream that accompanies one of the film's most memorable images was never made anywhere near the image that it accompanies. Number 10. The filming location created real problems for the neighborhood. The production of Home Alone in Winnetka, Illinois during the winter of 1989 to 1990 was a significant logistical event for the surrounding community. Film production in residential neighborhoods involves equipment, crew, vehicles, lighting rigs, and schedule disruptions that affect residents who have not consented to be part of the process. And winter filming in Chicago's suburbs added weather complications that extended the production's footprint further than a summer shoot would have. The specific challenges included the management of snow. Real snow on the ground created continuity requirements that a production using artificial snow could control more precisely, and the cold, which affected equipment performance, crew endurance, and the physical demands on the child performers who were outside for extended sequences. The neighborhood's relationship to the production was mixed during filming, and has evolved considerably since. Winnetka residents who were present during the shoot have given interviews over the decades, ranging from fond recollection to more qualified accounts of the disruption involved. The long-term outcome, the town's permanent association with one of the most beloved Christmas films ever made, and the tourist traffic that association generates, has generally been assessed as a net positive, but the production itself was a more complicated presence than the nostalgic account of it suggests. Number 11. The film made. Macaulay Culkin, the highest-paid child actor in history. Home Alone's box office performance transformed Macaulay Culkin's professional circumstances with a speed that had few precedents in the history of child performance. Before the film opened, he was a working child actor with an emerging reputation. After it became the phenomenon it was, he was the most famous child in America, and his fee for subsequent projects reflected that status with an abruptness that the entertainment industry was not entirely prepared for. For Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, released in 1992, Culkin negotiated a salary of approximately $5 million, a figure that made him the highest-paid child performer in the history of Hollywood at that point. The negotiation was conducted primarily by his father, Kit Culkin, whose management of his son's career became a significant topic of public discussion during this period, and whose approach to the business of Macaulay's stardom was the subject of considerable scrutiny. The velocity of the transition from working actor to global phenomenon to highest-paid child in Hollywood in approximately 2 years was unusual enough that it had no good roadmap. The pressures it created, both on Culkin personally and on the family dynamics surrounding his career, were not immediately visible in the films he was making, but became more apparent as the decade progressed and the circumstances of his childhood became more publicly discussed. Number 12. The Wet Bandits were named with specific intent. The name Wet Bandits was not a random comic invention. Harry and Marv's practice of flooding every house they rob, leaving a tap running as a kind of signature, was a plot device that served a specific narrative function. It gave Kevin a way to identify them to the police and gave the audience a way to understand that these were not competent criminals, but vain, self-defeating ones. The decision to give the villains a habit that was both menacing and fundamentally stupid was part of the film's careful calibration of how threatening Harry and Marv should be. They needed to be threatening enough to make Kevin's danger feel real and his victory feel meaningful, but not so threatening that the comedy of their suffering became disturbing rather than satisfying. The Wet Bandits' signature was a perfect expression of that balance. It was a criminal calling card that announced both their ambition and their incompetence simultaneously. The name has entered the language as a cultural reference point beyond the film itself, used to describe any situation in which someone's distinguishing characteristic is simultaneously their most obvious vulnerability, the self-defeating signature that makes the person responsible easy to identify and ultimately easy to catch. Number 13. The Angels with Filthy Souls scene was shot specifically for the film. One of the most effective comic elements in Home Alone is Kevin's use of a fictional gangster film, Angels with Filthy Souls, to frighten away visitors he doesn't want to deal with. The film within a film appears at 2 key moments, once when Kevin uses it to terrify the pizza delivery boy, and once when he deploys it against Harry at the door. What most viewers don't know is that Angels with Filthy Souls is not a real film. The footage was written and shot specifically for Home Alone, created as a pastiche of 1930s and 1940s gangster cinema with enough period authenticity to read as genuine vintage footage on a television screen. The actor playing the gangster Johnny, Michael Guido, was cast specifically for this insert, and the production designed the sequence with the grain, aspect ratio, and tonal characteristics of actual period film to make the deception convincing. The sequence worked so well that it was reprised in Home Alone 2, in which a sequel to the fictional film, Angels with Even Filthier Souls, serves the same narrative function. The fictional film within a film became one of the franchise's most recognized recurring elements, a self-contained comedy bit that retained its effectiveness across both installations. The production value invested in making fake vintage footage look genuinely old was one of the more unusual line items in the film's budget. Number 14. Chris Columbus fought to keep the emotional ending. The reunion between Kevin and his mother, Kate, at the end of Home Alone was the subject of editorial disagreement during the film's post-production. The argument on one side was that the film had been primarily a comedy, that audiences had come for the slapstick and the traps, and the wet bandits getting punished, and that extending the emotional register into genuine feeling at the end was a miscalibration that risked leaving audiences in an unexpectedly tender place. Columbus disagreed, and the strength of his disagreement was sufficient to keep the ending in its current form. His argument was that the film had never been purely a comedy, that Kevin's loneliness was real, that his mother's panic was real, and that the reunion was the emotional transaction the entire film had been building toward, whether the audience had consciously registered that or not. To resolve the story with anything less than genuine feeling would be to betray what the film had actually been about under its comic surface. The decision to trust the audience with real emotion at the end of a broad family comedy was one of the reasons Home Alone endured where comparable films from the same period have not. Audiences left the cinema having experienced something more than they expected, and that surprise, the discovery that a film they had come to for laughs had also managed to move them, was the engine of the word of mouth that drove its extraordinary box office run. Number 15. The film's legacy changed. How Hollywood thought about family cinema. Home Alone's commercial success in 1990 was not simply a box office event. It was a recalibration of what the film industry understood about family audiences and what they were willing to pay to see. The conventional wisdom before the film opened was that family comedies had a moderate ceiling. They could perform well, but not extraordinarily, because families were a constrained demographic whose cinema attendance was limited by logistics and price sensitivity. Home Alone demonstrated that a family film that genuinely connected with its audience could perform at a scale previously associated only with summer blockbusters and adult prestige productions. The holiday timing was significant. The film opened in the November corridor that would eventually become one of the most competitive release windows in the calendar. But the timing alone didn't explain the performance. The film's specific connection with its audience did. The industry response was immediate and visible across the following decade. Family comedies received larger budgets and more serious development attention because the Home Alone model had proven that the investment could produce extraordinary returns. Chris Columbus went on to direct Mrs. Doubtfire and eventually the first two Harry Potter films, following a career path that was shaped by what Home Alone had demonstrated about his ability to find the emotional truth inside large-scale family entertainment. John Hughes, characteristically, moved quickly. He produced Home Alone 2 within 2 years and continued to develop family properties at a pace that reflected his conviction that the audience the original film had found was real and loyal. The franchise that Home Alone launched, 2 theatrical sequels, television films, and eventually a remake, is the commercial expression of a creative decision to take a family comedy seriously, scored properly, cast precisely, and trusted to mean something to the people watching it. That's 15 facts behind the Christmas film that nobody in Hollywood predicted and that nobody has been able to replicate since. From the studio that passed and paid for it for decades, to the aftershave scene that almost didn't make the cut, to the fake gangster film that was built from scratch for 2 minutes of screen time, Home Alone was made with more care and more intelligence than its premise ever required, and that care is why it still works. Which fact changed how you see the film? Whether it was Joe Pesci's deliberate distance from Culkin, John Williams treating it like a serious score, or the editorial fight that kept the emotional ending intact, this was a film that earned its place in the cultural calendar one decision at a time. If this brought back memories of watching Kevin booby-trap his house every December, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still winces at the paint cans. And until next time, keep watching Back Before TV and Cinema.